Hello, it's a long time since the last video. I only have a quick one today, and I'm fitting it in between doing university work. Things are normally very busy at the moment, but I thought this was an important topic. I have recently had a confirmed assessment, a ratified assessment, confirming that I have sensory processing dysfunction or disorder. This is something that around 66% of people with a neurological difference, such as attention deficit disorder and bipolar disorder and autism spectrum disorders as well, often present with, as I say, around 66% of people with neurological differences tend to have a difference in sensory processing in areas that are extreme enough to interfere with daily functioning and daily living, which is why this would be assessed as a disorder, because it interferes with day-to-day living. It's not just something that I experience every so often, something that irritates me a little bit, because that is the normal profile with certain things. This is something that actually interferes with living day-to-day for me. Often SPD is characterized by having a hyper awareness to things going on in the background, strange errors, sort of repeated, seemingly careless errors in doing things, and apparent deficits, so apparent shortcomings in ability to learn or grasp new skills and carry out skilled activities. In children, it's noted a lot that the symptoms can result in behavioural, emotional, and social difficulties. People with SPD can feel completely bombarded by sensory information coming at them. They can crave, just look at my paperwork down here, they can crave very intense experiences, sensory experiences, such as the sort of thing that you would have on a fairground ride, for example, or they might be unable to relate to senses that other people talk about or the sensations that other people feel. It may not feel like it relates to the individual with SPD. As an adult, I'll add that it's hopefully not manifesting in a behavioral way, but I would say that the emotional and social difficulties do kind of layer on top of the difficulties that I experience, and many people with Asperger's syndrome also experience in carrying out day-to-day living, day-to-day activities, social activities. I would say that SPD just adds a layer on top of that again, that just sort of makes things that little bit harder in a way that isn't necessarily defined by the autism spectrum diagnosis. Just as a quick recap, there are 8 senses that are discussed by occupational therapists, and those are visual, auditory, which is hearing, tactile, which is what you feel essentially, taste, which is the gustatory sensation, smell, which is the olfactory sensation, position in space or in relation to where you are stood, where you are sat, how you are sat, how you are lying, how you are stood. That's called vestibular sensation. There is the intent, so that is the neurological aspect of the senses. It's your intent to do something, let's just say that, and that's called interoception. And then finally we have movement, and that's similar to vestibular but a little bit different. It's not your position, it's your movement, so it's moving with an awareness of objects around you, people around you, things around you, obstacles, and that's proprioception. So that's the 8 senses that are discussed by occupational therapists in terms of SPD. So something that isn't discussed so much by the National Autistic Society, this is their book. It's one of the most recent books regarding sensory matters, but they discuss sensory issues in a very generalized term. This is actually in line with DSM-5, For those that don't know, this is the American Psychiatric Association, sorry, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This is used in the UK, but it's an American-led document. Here we are. I do have a copy. Autism spectrum disorders are near the front. 99, I think, very usefully named 99. So interestingly, regarding autism spectrum disorders, it generally is the DSM-5 definition that's used, even though this is an American manual. Something else that's talked about is the ICD-10, and that's the International Categorization of Disorders, from memory. That's a European document, but I suppose the best way to describe it is that both documents influence each other, and a diagnosis is normally a combination of the statements and the diagnostic factors within both documents when a diagnosis is come about, especially in terms of adults, where it's more of an objective assessment, because you're doing the assessment through question and answer rather than observed behaviours, I suppose. So it's not quite so medicalised, it's slightly more question and answer based. So what I wanted to summarise really, and I feel like I'm waffling here, is that there is diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorders in DSM-5, and that's new. DSM-5, as you've seen there, was published in 2013. Now, some people say that there have been updates to it. There have been updates to it, but none of the updates have actually discuss autism spectrum disorders. So in terms of that diagnostic criteria, it stays as it has done in the published version of the book, as I showed you there. So what I wanted to say about SPD in relation to the autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, which by the way is category number 299.00 brackets F84.0 in the DSM-5 manual. It's in part B, so the idea is that you would say there's, it says somewhere, there has to be a certain number of aspects that are in part A and a certain number that are in part B, and there is normally some other criteria that have to be met as well, and that comes further on. But in section B of this diagnostic criteria, in the category which is restricted repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests or activities as manifested by at least two of the following, currently or by history, so two of these, does mention as the fourth item hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of environment, e.g. apparent indifference to pain or temperature, adverse response to specific sounds or textures, excessive smelling or touching of objects, visual fascination with lights or movement. It's a good example. People do mention that craving is also mentioned in this criteria. I would say not directly, it's not discussed exactly as craving, as in the really intense need for a very specific sensation, but it's alluded to. The main part of the criteria, as I say, relates to the autism spectrum disorder criteria, section 4, section B, item 4. It's there, just so you know. It's not talked about in relation to attention deficit disorder or any of the others as yet. At the moment, that's the only diagnostic criteria that alludes to sensory processing disorder, but there's a lot of lobbying going on for the next version of the manual to contain a specific diagnosis of sensory processing disorder. So coming back to the I suppose occupational therapy led definition of sensory processing disorder, The whole thing kicked off actually quite a long time ago. This book was published in 1979, thanks to UE Library for this, University of the West of England's library for having copies of these books. This is from there. So this is Jane Eyre's Sensory Integration in the Child. Not a very accessible volume to my mind, and very much a product of its time. I haven't really had a read of this yet. It's a starting point. It's where things began, and Jean Eyres, is considered the person who first documented SPD in a usable format. So that's where it all started, really. This book, 1979, Sensory Integration of the Child, by Jean Eyres. There are other books. As I say, just as a recap, this one by the NAS really talks about sensory strategies in relation to that general ASD diagnostic criteria. It really answers that question in DSM-5 rather than talking about sensory processing disorder in its own right. It's useful. It has some resources. It has some what would be widely known as integration therapy strategies, which can be tried at home. Very useful for parents with children experiencing sensory issues. Difficult for me to access really as an adult. First 4 pages are useful because they do discuss what it means to have sensory challenges, but it doesn't really have any usable information in it, and that's something I'm experiencing a lot at the moment. I haven't really found something that necessarily directly talks about adults who are in further education or work, for example, or any day-to-day adult living, independent living, I suppose, really, and how to overcome certain sensory challenges, even if there are strategies for this. Maybe it's something I could look at in the future. Anyway, back on task. Right, so in the occupational therapy world, there is a picture of this, I think, in this book. No, in the Autistic Child, I think there are categories that sit underneath sensory processing disorder as the wider explanation, which I think is interesting. There we go. So there is categories, subcategories, and then categories under that. I'm not going to use this definition because there are more recent definitions out there, so I'm using a more recent definition that's moved on again. This book is quite useful, but that's for in a minute. So the main types, as we're saying now, that are discussed up to sort of the medical level now, I have discovered through my own assessment. Type 1 is sensory modulation disorder, or SMD. Underneath that, there are subcategories which are sensory over-responsivity, sensory under-responsivity, sensory seeking and sensory craving. Then we have another type, which is the sensory discrimination disorder. Difficulty in interpreting certain characteristics of sensory stimuli. There are many subcategories to this. There is tactile discrimination disorder, gustatory or oral discrimination disorder, olfactory discrimination disorder, auditory discrimination disorder, visual discrimination disorder, vestibular discrimination disorder, proprioceptive discrimination disorder, interoceptive discrimination disorder. So essentially, all of the senses are covered by their own specific disorders. This, importantly, has a lot to do with behaviour in children. So a lot of difficult behaviour in children has now been identified to be in relation to this constant overstimulation from certain senses that isn't being removed. So they're in constant continued contact with this sort of sensory overpowering information, and therefore it can reflect in behaviour. If that's added to the factors involved in autism spectrum disorders, then there are many potential triggers for behaviour, and it's probably worth trying to understand what each cause of the behavior is, because it may seem like everything is behaviorally triggering, but that's probably not the case. There probably are specific things, but some things may be related to autism spectrum disorder, some things may be sensory related, and there probably is a way around a lot of it. It's strategies. It's got to be strategies. As an adult, I'm realizing that I'm needing to learn and understand strategies as well. Okay, back to what I was saying. Type 3 is sensory-based motor disorder. Now, there are two types here. Interestingly, one of them is essentially the occupational therapist version of diagnosing dyspraxia or assessing dyspraxia. The other version is what's called postural disorder, which is about having difficulty with balance or core stability, problems eating, problems focusing, and as a child, a delay in these motor function skills. Slightly different to dyspraxia, a little bit more of a limited focus, more about ability to control the body in relation to what the body is trying to do, I think is a good summary. So going back to the beginning again, just seeing if there's anything to cover on the first page of my little report that I've written for myself to understand everything with. No, that's the first page covered. Yeah, that's fine. So if we go back to type, well, I'm not going to say type 1, 2, and 3 because different publications seem to mix up the three major categories. So we'll say, if we go back to sensory modulation disorder, SMD, sensory over-responsivity as much as it sounds, responding too much, too soon, for too long, having a fight or flight response to sensory inputs, eating a very limited range of food, which is something I can absolutely resonate with, because I still now in my late 30s have a rather limited diet, and it's very frustrating, but it has a lot to do with colours, textures, smells. It's the sensory experience of eating that makes my diet limited, if that makes sense. As it says, a dislike of certain fabric, me, again, clothing labels, touching hair or teeth, which is why, I might add, going to the hairdresser, going to the dentist in general is a really big thing for people with sensory processing disorder, SPD, because this whole touching teeth, touching hair thing is like a major no-no area, and that on top of the multi-sensory smells, sounds, lighting, busyness sort of situation that is going to a hairdresser or dental practice as well is just a really overwhelming experience. Not so much a phobia, more of an overwhelming. So the opposite is sensory under-responsivity, and that's being unaware of stimuli. So someone pinches you and you don't feel like it's a pinch, or it doesn't feel pinchy, it feels just fine. Not particularly nerve-ending, disturbing, let's say. Craving strongly flavoured foods, which I experience as well. I really like a bit of spice, a bit of barbecue sauce, a bit of sweetness, that sort of thing. Weight issues, somehow tied into under-responsivity, weight, posture, tone, and an unkempt appearance. Yeah, maybe, let's say. And a high pain threshold, which again goes with what I was saying earlier. And the last part of this is the sensory seeking or craving, where the person is unsatisfied even with the presence of that sensory stimulation. So they want more, they want it in a higher volume than they're getting right now. Even if it's present, they want it ramped up, amped up to the max, basically. They're always moving around, and they explore everything with all sorts of senses. So they might want to taste as well as touch. They might want to hear as well as smell. They want to use everything. So this subtype, this general sensory modulation disorder, encompasses inconsistent response to senses. It can be affecting planning, carrying out of tasks. Learning can be affected because everything is happening at the same level. Nothing is in the background, every noise, every smell, every sight, every sound, everything you touch. It's all at the same level. Nothing is a priority, less of a priority. Everything is up there all the time, all the input all the time. Something I experience a lot, and it does make learning very hard. So it's not being able to filter out that irrelevant stimuli, as I was alluding to, and trying to filter it out requires conscious effort, which, like a lot of things with Asperger's syndrome as well, is a very exhausting task. It's important to say and emphasize it requires conscious effort. Nothing is in the subconscious. It's all conscious. It's all requiring thought, requiring a decision to process that input, which I hope makes sense. Interestingly, it has been mentioned in various papers that adults who have not had effective treatment for this, I don't know if there is really effective treatment. It's early days in my diagnosis. I can't really speak for it, but it does mention that in adult life, anxiety, depression, and low mood are very distinct possibilities for adults who are not aware of and trying to work with their sensory stimuli challenges. So type 2, I really glossed over, but the other type is sensory discrimination disorder. So I'm assessed by my occupational therapist and now ratified by my GP as having sensory modulation disorder and sensory discrimination disorder. So you sort of get, I'm saying diagnosis, assessment and ratification of one of the three major types within sensory processing disorder. It doesn't normally go into the detail of section A, section B, section C, section D, but it normally does say and difficulties in modulation and difficulties in discrimination, which is what mine essentially says, my report. So sensory discrimination disorder is describing difficulties in interpreting specific characteristics of sensory stimulation, speed, intensity, duration, timing, and it's not being able to discriminate between relevant and irrelevant sensory stimulation. So you can see these two sort of, they combine, but this has more to do with not being able to kind of quite get a grip on the speed, the intensity, the time you've taken with something. So it's a bit more internalized. It's a bit more of an internal challenge, as well as the actual processing of the input. This is as much as sort of the processing of the input is also a challenge. And we go into the various senses. If this video proves popular, I will go into that, but I'm aware that we're 20 plus minutes in now, so I may not go into each of the 8 subcategories. They are much as you can imagine in general. I'm just having a look. Let's go into the last 3, vestibular, proprioceptive and interoceptive challenges. So with vestibular discrimination disorder, the person can't identify their position of head, body, or their elevation of body, so they can't work out where that is in relation to the floor, the ceiling, the walls. They can't work out where their body is in regarding to the same, and they can't work out whether they're standing, sitting at a funny angle. Everything's a bit uncertain as to where their position is. Even on this chair, I feel like I'm sitting forwards like this right now, although I'm actually not. Something that the occupational therapist suggested was a moving sit, actually, which I do use most of the time. I'm just not using for this video, but this actually is giving me a bit more core stability, or a chance to adapt my core stability, and I feel a bit more aware of what's around me when I'm using this. It's very useful, actually. So there's that. There's also poor posture or clumsiness going alongside this, makes sense. Disorientation and a feeling or risk of falling, as you can well imagine. If you're not sure where you are, you're not sure if you're at a funny angle or not, that risk of falling is high, because you might think you're standing straight, but you're actually leaning forwards a little bit, for example. Okay, so proprioceptive discrimination disorder is having difficulty working out how much force you need to apply to something. And case in point, also recommended by my occupational therapist, is specialised cutlery. This is called Curacare cutlery, actually. Comes as a set of 3 like this, a sort of universal spoon, knife and fork. Now, I have trouble with, I've shown you my pens before, haven't I? My pens like this one. So this one really helps me because I cannot work out how much force to put on the paper. So I really push down, and then eventually my hand moves down, and eventually the pen's popping out of my hand because I've got my hands right down to the paper. My writing is going through the paper. This pen with the rubber grip stops that, and in a very similar way, a knife and fork with these solid grips mean that it doesn't matter how much force I apply. If I have really sort of had a hard day and I'm not able to regulate my senses properly, these are helping me by just not letting me worry about how much force I'm using. They've got a chunky handle, I can get whatever grip I need, and I can use rough control, vague control, and still have control over cutting up my food. That's a good example. I'm going to put these in actually. So that's that's your proprioceptive challenges. And then lastly, the interoceptive discrimination disorder is not being able to judge how thirsty the person is. I have this. Not being able to judge hunger, nausea, breathlessness, or need to use the bathroom. For me, it's too late normally. Not too late, but it's at the last minute. I don't plan for being thirsty. I am too thirsty. Then I get a drink. I leave it too long. So yeah, it's something I can relate to. So that's really what section 2 covers. Very much as I said. And perception of the left and right side is affected within discrimination disorder as well. So type 3, finally, sensory-based motor disorder. I actually described that largely earlier, but I will go through it again quickly. So with postural disorder, subtype of this sensory-based motor disorder, there is disturbed balance and core stability, eating difficulties. Again, that's reflecting an earlier type. Poor object focus and delayed motor skills. And dyspraxia, as observed by an occupational therapist, is regarding sequencing, motor planning and organisation, being more likely to use imagination to avoid performing physical tasks, impaired fine motor skills, so I'm showing you the cutlery again. Handwriting is a big issue, hence my pen. Visual perception issues and delayed motor skills. So it's really helpful to look at undertaking physical activity and exercise that doesn't need specific hand-eye coordination. So rather than a competitive sport, maybe looking at something like swimming, walking, running, that doesn't involve you to coordinate looking for something, catching it, throwing it, for example. So finally, as time's ticking on, I will just mention strategies. There's talk of treatment. I am very much in my early phase. I have just received the confirmation by a GP and working on what's going to happen next with the support of my student funding body. But I don't know if treatments work yet. I don't know if it is a treatment or whether it's strategies to avoid too much of the difficulty that these assessed disorders actually bring with them. So the major therapy that's discussed and talked about in the Outer Sync Child and talked about by Jean Ayres is sensory integration therapy, and it's suggested that this is carried out like the assessment I had actually by an occupational therapist, and there is a sort of a terminology of the OTSI, so occupational therapist with sensory integration knowledge. There are other useful services which could be of use, but I understand all need reaching out to in their own way, and I know that can be a challenge, especially as an adult outside of the earlier intervention frameworks. But It's recommended that services such as physiotherapy, speech and language therapy, vision therapy, auditory training, chiropractic therapy, maybe even martial arts for children, nutritional therapy, perceptual motor therapy could be of use. I don't even know what some of these are myself. One is mentioned called hippotherapy. I don't know what that is yet. I'm thinking there's space for another video, and I'll let you know what that is when I find out more. So the main strategies are to try and time manage and forward plan your time. Use sensorily helpful equipment. If you have an official assessment, your occupational therapy will very much help with this sort of thing. This is an example. It's not expensive, my move and sit, but it's proven very useful. It's worth speaking to your occupational therapist before investing in this equipment because it's not too much on its own, but it all adds up. This set of cutlery, these 3 items of cutlery, costs £10, and I bought 4 sets of these. So, cost of a cheap set of 16-piece cutlery for just 3 pieces of cutlery. So it does add up quite quickly. So it's worth getting advice from your occupational therapist as to what you purchase. If you go out there alone, brilliant, fair enough. You're trying to make interventions as well as you can, but it could get expensive very quickly. So just be warned of that. Okay. Consideration of various outcomes of a situation can be very helpful. So looking at what might come out of something you're planning to do or discuss with a manager, for example. Being given space and time to calm yourself and with a graceful exit strategy for these challenges that may come your way is very useful. Good communication from those working with the person with SPD is very helpful. Being encouraged to participate actively in training and in learning helps the person to stay engaged, as someone with Asperger's or dyspraxia would also experience. Controlled environment, consistent routines, planned transitions, built-in movement breaks, if you can get them, fantastic. Or finding a way to build movement into a break is very good. And having time to process information and sensory input are considered helpful strategies, something worth mentioning. So the sources for my little talk today, my half-an-hour talk, the Potential Plus UK, who have a useful fact sheet. Sensory processing disorder and high learning potential, fact sheet F05, available from Potential Plus UK. SPD Start, subtypes of SPD, which is a page on their website. And the subtype definitions were derived from the Sensory Integration Network, and that is sinetwork.org. I have found a useful little poster that's produced by SPD Foundation, who are now SPD Star, I understand it. It's useful. I think it's worth possibly putting up there if you're wanting to have some neurological information up there in a public space. It's not everyone, but it's things that you might find in your person with SPD. Some of, don't expect them to have everything. It's not a diagnosis only because they have everything. If you think there's significant concerns, then talk about it. Okay. I hope that's been useful. I will just mention what's on this poster actually. I cry and shield my eyes from lights. I have selective hearing or difficulty listening, picky eater, complain about tags in clothing, unaware of normal touch or pain, hate being tickled, hate having my hair washed or cut, walk on my tiptoes, trouble focusing or concentrating, overly sensitive, always smelling people, food and objects, chewing on everything, poor fine motor skills for handwriting or cutting, difficulty dressing myself, and I sit with my legs in a strange position, and I wear my socks just so, and I'm never barefoot. Yeah, it's all possible. I have poor gross motor skills, like for things like running or riding a bike. So it's quite a nice summary. It's a nice poster to have up there. I think there's more awareness needed. I would say that the awareness is probably best targeted in a space that works with people with other other neurological differences as well, because it seems like the two in many cases go hand in hand. I'm sure I've got more to say in the future. I have got more books that I haven't really gone into yet. I think I've shown you the most useful ones. I will give an honourable mention to this book, Building Bridges. It's mentioned often. Building Bridges Through Sensory Integration, 3rd edition, by Ellen Yack, Paula Aquila, and Shirley Sutton. It's from around 2015. It's good. It tells me a lot. It's written a little bit like a thesis in terms of its layout. Literally looks like it's a Word document that's been printed out. I like it, but it has a lot of you really should speak to your occupational therapist in it, which is fair enough, because I think to do things properly, it's good to have the professional input rather than trying to do the guesswork. This one, there's a 2nd edition of this. It's not a cheap book though. This is what UE Library had. This is the 1st edition. It's not new, 1991, and the 2nd edition is from 2002, but we're talking about a £50 book, so I'm really having to, I want to read this one and decide whether it's worth the 33 or so pounds I can pay on eBay for it used. This is more, I would say, the book that the occupational therapist might use in developing integration therapy, sensory integration therapy. So it's interesting for someone like me that likes to know the evidence base behind things. This is more the book to grab, but as I say, it's not a new volume. That's Building Bridges book is by far the newest that's specifically related to SPD. I hope that's been useful. I will speak to you again. I was thinking of another video, but didn't expect this one to take so long. So, case of one thing at a time, I think. Hope it's been interesting. Bye for now.